Oh,
Indeed, Larry. As if
yes.
by magic, here you are,
Okay. Okay.
going to wow us of your insights and adventures
Oh,
from your history in Legal Island, our,
oh,
shall we
oh,
say, our sister
oh.
organization.
Okay. Okay. Um, would you like me just to spend a few minutes just explaining who I am and my
Please
background,
do.
if that's all right? Now, it's, to give permission to a lawyer to do that is very dangerous because he could still be speaking an hour later, knowing how much lawyers love talking about themselves. But I promise I'll keep it to just a few minutes. For my sins, I started my life out as a barrister working in London doing criminal defence work. I realised I wasn't enjoying that, so I came over to Ireland, to the north, and practiced over in the northwest for a while. And I didn't really enjoy that either, and it made me think it's to do with the profession rather than the actual subject. So I got out of the legal profession and I started my own business, still in the area of compliance, basically helping employers to understand how to interpret the ever expanding number of European directives that were coming out of Brussels and Luxembourg at the time. That was about 25 years ago. Started in the north, but we are now all island of Ireland. I have 25 staff, and I have quite a strong interest in D&I and its development. There's a few things I'd like to say about that a bit later on. But I'm also very interested in creativity and innovation. I was particularly keen to sort of move into this circle when Charlie told me about it, because having come from the legal profession, there wasn't an awful lot of creativity and innovation going on in such a stuffy industry. And in fact, I forgot to tell you an anecdote. When I was training to be a barrister in London, and I was a pupil barrister, I had all these great ideas in terms of how to change things and to improve our service in the set. And eventually, I felt safe enough and confident enough just to mention one to my pupil master. And I forget exactly what it was, but he said, just almost holding onto his lapels for delivery, he said, "My dear boy, we've been doing things like this in chambers for the last 400 years. Why on earth should we change now?" And it gave me an indication that I was in the wrong place. I'm in amongst the wrong people, and I needed to get out. And it took me far too long to, I think, really realize that, and too much time afterwards to do anything about it. But I'm now in the business world, entrepreneur world, and it's exciting. And it's the place I love moving around, and I love meeting people, giving them two crazy ideas and getting five back from them. So I'm happy in my space, if you like. So on to today's topic. What I would like to do, if this is okay with everybody, is just share my views on this book. This is Matthew Syed's book, Rebel Ideas, The Power of Diverse Thinking. Can I just ask for a show of hands if you've read this book at all? If you
Nope.
haven't, that's
So
great.
we're all
Oh,
ears.
one hand.
Oh, Alan.
Okay. Okay. And was that Owen as well? Have you read it or no? Okay. Show of hands if you've heard about it. Yeah, okay. It's by a guy called Matthew Syed. Now, you may know Matthew Syed because he writes, I think he writes for the Times. He's also written a number of books, in this same sort of genre. And he also does a very good podcast in the evenings, something like Sideways or something, when he just looks at very random things in quite a different way. I checked this morning on Amazon, it's a tenner. And if you have somebody in your organization that is struggling to get D&I, this is a great first book to give them. Summer holiday reading, slip your chairman or your CEO this and just say, have a read of this, because it is a good, easy read and it's a great introduction to D&I. So if that applies to you, then I think it's a tenor well spent. So he says a number of things that I think are important to creativity and innovation. I'd just like to touch on those before I then just touch on some D&I points. And then I'm going to finish on 5 things that we do in my company that are designed to stimulate creativity and innovation, in case you feel those would be useful to try wherever you are. And good afternoon, Amazon. Nice to see you, and also Martin as well. So the first thing he says in this book is the importance of moving in different circles. And he talks about this, of course, and it's an obvious thing to say, I know, but he comes with some quite interesting examples. He gave an example of Steve Jobs when he was, I think, head of Pixel, and they had an opportunity to design a complete new building from the ground upwards. That Steve Jobs insisted that the toilets would be in the middle of this building, so that you would have all these people from different departments at least 2 or 3 times a day with the opportunity to bump in to one another. I don't know if he made them gender neutral so that everybody had the opportunity to bump into everybody else at some point. But that's one example that he gave. Another example is that he looked at a few universities in the United States and their record for in the area of creativity and innovation. And of those that he sampled, he actually saw that the smaller universities were generally doing better than the bigger universities. And the explanation that he gives there in the book is that he felt there was better cross-pollination of disciplines in the smaller universities because they were closer together and therefore more likely to mix and mingle. And from that sort of mixing and mingling, you would get some sparks of some very original and different ideas. The next thing he says is the importance of diversity in your own circle. And he talks quite a bit about blind spots and the help that everybody needs to have blind spots revealed to them. And he gives some examples to illustrate this. One was the poll tax that people may be familiar with from the UK. I think it was in the 80s or early 90s that Margaret Thatcher tried to introduce the poll tax. And he mentions in the book that the poll tax was actually devised by a group of senior male MPs who had all had a very privileged, almost aristocratic upbringing. And they talked afterwards about how enjoyable their meetings were at the local men's club not far from Westminster, when they were designing and talking about this tax that would have a disproportionately hard impact on poorer people within the UK society. Another example he gives is Bin Laden. And he said that he felt the CIA missed some very early warning signs from Bin Laden. And they did so because he was pointing to the homogenous group in the CIA that had the brief of looking out for dangers coming from that part of the world. And he noted that they were all almost entirely from Ivy League universities. They were almost entirely male, white, and of one religion. And he argues, and with some force, that if there had been a better mix and representation of diversity within that group, then there would have been a stronger chance to understand the true threat that was coming from Bin Laden, even from his early videos. And gives an example. I can't quite remember the real detail of it, but he said one of the early videos that he was sharing was Bin Laden in a cave where he was living. And he was saying that the CIA would have probably interpreted this as somebody who was a down and out and not doing well in life and no particular threat to anybody, whereas somebody from a different background would have read it and said, well, cave is very symbolic of somebody that feels that they're very powerful and that they're on a mission to really do something and change the world. He goes on to talk about homophily, which I'm sure everybody in the group will know is this faintly depressing tendency of human beings to gravitate people who are like themselves, and indeed to go out and look for people that are like ourselves. And coming back to your earlier observation, Catherine, as I look at the group, you might sort of say that's fairly reflected in terms of who's in the group today. And Syed says that it is something that we all need to fight and to be aware of. And we often don't know that there is this sort of invisible hand that is driving us towards people that are similar to ourselves. And give you an example of this, a few years back, I was invited by a big engineering company here in Antrim to a half-day conference which was on diversity and inclusion. And I went along really because I don't move in the engineering circles at all. So I thought this is a good opportunity for me just to land in a completely different industry, in amongst very different people. And who knows what sort of contact I'll pick up. Anyway, I arrived, I went into the room, I was a little bit late, and there was just a few places available in this very big room. And I saw a friend of mine that is in the D&I space that I've known for many years, who was in the middle of the room, who saw me come into the room and immediately took his bag from a seat, which was by him, to free it up for me to sit down. And I thought, well, no, the reason I really came here was to find somebody I hadn't met before and get talking to them. So I went to the back of the room to the one other place that was still free, and I sat at the back. And I immediately thought, I wonder is this friend of mine who's going to think I'm a bit ignorant or that I'm avoiding him for whatever reason. So of course, in the break time, the first thing I did was to go up and say hello to make sure he wasn't put out by me wanting to sit somewhere else other than by him. And we got stuck into a conversation, and that led to another conversation. And then we went back to listen to the extra 2 sessions. Then he had to leave, and then I left. So really, my real adventure or my brief to myself to go and find somebody else that in a different kind of world failed at the first hurdle. So algorithms is something else that Syed talks about on social media. And, you know, if it's not difficult enough in the real world to move and break free of these circles that kind of force you towards the same people, he notices that algorithms, particularly by Facebook and LinkedIn, just work very, very hard to drive people with the same interests together. And I picked up this stat. Now, I have to say, I can't remember the reference for it, but it did stick in my mind that 65% of all those that were in the mob that stormed Capitol Hill in the US a while ago had found each other through or courtesy of an algorithm somehow which had brought them all together. So it is, if that is true or even somewhere like accurate, it's an indication of just how powerful these things can be, but also how dangerous, I guess, they can be as well. So He talks about echo chambers and basically getting it into places in which you just hear your own view echoed back to you, which reinforces that you're right, rather than hearing a very different point of view, which helps you to critique what it is that you think you know. What he says about D&I itself, I think is quite interesting, because he argues that a diverse team will always outperform a homogeneous team, all other things being equal. And it's that all other things being equal thing that I struggle with, because, of course, all other things are never equal, are they? They're completely different. But what I think he does fail to really emphasize, and this is a big danger, is that, and perhaps you've been to conferences in which you've heard a speaker talk on a D&I issue, and they tend to start right at the beginning with this given, that the greater the D&I, the greater your bottom line in an organization. And I'd like to say, I think, two things about that. First of all, I haven't found any research that backs that up. You hear it time and time again, but if anybody has come across any reliable research that backs that up, then please educate me, because I haven't found it. There is correlative research. McKinsey always puts out this thing and say of the top 100 organizations, 85% of them do D&I really well. Therefore, it follows that D&I is good for your bottom line. I think we need quite a bit more than that. That's the first thing. The other thing that is said and just sort of thrown out there is that it will automatically lead to your a better bottom line. But what they don't say is that there is a danger with a sudden increase in diversity, that if you don't upskill managers, then they may struggle to actually manage a more diverse team. So rather than your bottom line increasing, you might actually have a situation in which your bottom line actually goes down. And so in an ideal world, I'd love people to sort of say diversity is really important in an organization, but I'd also like them to talk at the same time about how you upskill managers so that they can cope with this added diversity, because it can be challenging. Yes, you will get a greater range of ideas, but you will also, I think, get greater demands on your management skills as well. Matthew Syed says about this point in his book something. He basically says, if you ask 10 people for 10 ideas, how many ideas are you going to get? And of course, the answer to that might be 10 if they're all the same. You know, they're all thinking the same, and so on. So that's something I've heard at a few events too. What he doesn't talk about very much, and I'd be very keen to hear the group's view on this, is the impact of cancel culture on the ability to throw around ideas and kick about crazy ideas, and just to feel relaxed in the workplace, to really come with what's ever on your mind, to share things. And this, to me, is a very disappointing development in D&I. I first got interested in it 6 years ago, and I developed a D&I gala, an awards evening in the north here, to try and encourage employers to do more in the D&I space, because I thought if we have greater diversity and we have greater inclusion of the ideas that are going to come from this diversity, it can only be a good thing for us here in the north. I think it's gone in a very different direction, and I'm really concerned about it, because my feeling is that because of cancel culture, people feel very, very reticent to volunteer ideas and their views. And I feel too that people are self-cancelling quite a bit. So it's not only that they're getting shot down and the discussion doesn't develop and become as healthy as it could be. It's just that a lot of discussion never starts, simply because people are thinking, if I say this, am I going to get shot down for it? And I think that, combined with the damage that employment law has done in the UK over quite a period of time, means that today we have a workforce, and I'm talking really about the North, where I've had recent experience of it, in which we have staff, I've got 25 staff here, who I think are very reticent to talk about anything which is at all controversial. And I think that's a real pity. I have in my company atheists, I have a couple of free Presbyterians, and I have other people who have religions that I'm not sure what their religious persuasion is. But it's a great pity that we can't over lunch chuck ideas around and talk about it. We don't feel free to do that. When I say damage that employment law has done, I'd just like to perhaps clarify that a little bit. The legislation that has dropped into the UK and also in Ireland in the form of the Equality Acts from 1998 have advanced significantly equality issues to a point that I think it's unrecognisable in both jurisdictions, both sides of the border. And where Ireland has come in those 30 years, nobody I think would have believed in 1998. It's had giant leaps forward. And when I first came here to the North, we would look at the Republic of Ireland and we wouldn't get too excited about what was going on, and we were kind of thinking they're 5-10 years behind. And with the advent of the Equality Acts, suddenly they shot forwards, and very often now in the UK we're looking for guidance from the Republic of Ireland in terms of how to interpret new cases and legislation. So it has really shot forward, and the UK has shot forward since the 1970s and the first Race Relations Act and so on. A lot of people would say they haven't gone forward fast enough, and I'd be inclined to agree with that. So the legislation has done a lot of good, but I think it did cause a lot of lawyers to advise employers and say, for goodness sake, don't encourage controversial discussion in the workplace because it will only lead to trouble. And I guess what I'm saying here is I don't think we have a healthy environment in the workplace today which allows us to talk about the kind of big ticket items that in the North we need to talk about, which is whether we want to stay British or whether we want to join with Dublin, the impact of the Bible Belt here, and many other things as well. And I feel if we did, then possibly people would feel more comfortable talking about anything and everything, which would also mean including business ideas, sharing crazy notions they have for business ideas, and just because they're in the habit of it, because they're in a working environment in which these things are swirling all about everywhere. And if you could just land the best of these ideas, it would be really great. Just looking at the time, I'm going to go for another 5-10 minutes and then I'll wrap up for Q&A. Is that all right with everyone? Okay.
Perfect. Yeah. Lovely.
Okay, thank you. I've talked about cancel culture. I've talked about self-cancelling. I'd just like to finish with 5 things that we do in my company at Legal Island in case they're of use to anybody in the group and you'd like to try them. They're quite random, they're quite different things, but in no particular order. What we experiment with in some of our bigger meetings is having a designated dissenter. So we will designate somebody to basically argue against the final outcome of the meeting. We designate them at the beginning of the meeting and we'll say, okay, John or Joan, it's your job at the end of this to tear it down and to show us what's wrong with it. And I guess it's a kind of safety valve mechanism for thinking, okay, if there is a lot of group think that's going on, or if somebody has taken over the meeting and they're too powerful, then there is that mechanism. We've had mixed reports on that, I have to say. I think in an ideal situation, I would designate more than one person. I would have 2 or 3 if it was in a meeting of like 12 or 14 people. Also, I think it has to be a different person every time. If you've got somebody who's going to shit on everything, if you pardon my language, at every meeting, it's not going to work so well. So that's one item. Number 2 is, I don't think we're very diverse in my company, but what I've tried to do is to redesign how we do many meetings so that we can tap into the diversity that we do have around the table. And there is quite a bit of it. And we experiment with a number of things. Sometimes we'll have a meeting in which we just do a round robin. We just go round the table for contributions, and we start with the most junior person that's in the organization, and we go from most junior or most recent in to the person that's been in there the longest. They tend to be the quieter ones, but if you get them starting first, they tend to come with different ideas or something which is a bit fresher than perhaps we would normally get. Another thing that we do in meetings is to go for written answers sometimes. So we'll ask a question and we'll ask for written answers, and they're just all put anonymously into a pot and then drawn out and read out. And we found that quite powerful sometimes, because if you do have a dominant personality in the group, if they speak first, then it tends to sway the views of others, and they tend to lean towards that dominant personality. Whereas, of course, if they wanted to do that, they couldn't, in going to a written system and having to read out other people's answers. D&I, of course, is great if you've got it, but if you have meetings that are not handled well, however diverse the people are around the table, the value of it could go if you've got a very dominant personality, and it's just like taking a wrecking ball to a meeting. So again, I think there's a big red flag there that we sort of say, okay, if you think you've got a very good diverse workforce and diverse teams, then there's still a lot of work to do, particularly in meetings, and you have to make sure that they are managed in a way that you can tap into that diversity. Number 3 on my list of 5 here is basically safety to speak issues. And I guess I mention this primarily because I know in the creativity and innovation space, a lot of people work in startups or SMEs, and safety to speak in those environments, speak out, to challenge, to criticize, is a very different environment than if you're a big organization, because you're likely to have the chairman or the CEO or the owner of that company in that small group with you. And however reasonable, open to feedback and criticism that person may be, you have to be realistic that that's the person that is funding your mortgage, or is decides whether you continue in your job or not. So there is this big issue, I think, in small companies of how you encourage staff to be critical, and not fear making mistakes and saying things that they might think are silly in front of the owner of the company. And it's a very difficult thing, I think, to achieve. When we go into creative sessions, I try and remind everybody at the start that the difference between a genius idea and a completely daft one is very, very thin. or the line is very thin and very blurred. So I would say to everybody, remind them, if you are sat on an idea and you think it may be daft, it may also be the genius idea that we're really looking for. So please try very, very hard to share that idea with others. I'm not sure if people are familiar with Nancy Klein's book, the seminal work, Thinking Environment, in which she basically says we need to spend an awful lot more time giving people the right environment in which to think. And she'll talk about the importance of meetings, of going around the table, but going round again and trying to squeeze everybody for that last contribution. Because she'll say it's that last squeeze contribution that is often the most valuable. Okay, so that was number 3. Number 4, we have a rule here in the company. It's a simple rule, but it's up on the wall, and it's never park in the same parking bay twice in a row. And we have this simply because we like to remind each other that when we come in the morning, of the importance of doing something which was different to what you first did the day before. Now, I'm not saying that I police this and I peer through the window at everybody as they park to make sure it's a different parking bay. But it is something that's on the wall that I do occasionally refer to. Likewise, in meetings, I try and encourage people not to sit in the same place. I try and encourage movement in meetings, particularly if it's a longer meeting, just to get the blood circulating and to give the idea that freshness and moving around is a good thing. Final thing we do at the company, with a newbie that arrives on their first day, they get called into the MD's office, and she gives them £10, and they have an hour to go and find something for the value of £10 or less to buy and to sell on eBay. And they have a week then to sell it on eBay, and we all have a load of fun just to see how well they do. It's a good talking point between all staff, but we like the exercise because it's interesting in terms of what people come back with and how they do things. I think it is a good exercise to illustrate just how difficult it is to make money sometimes in business, and it's important, I think, for every member of staff to know that. But it's amazing too what people come back with. We had one member of staff many years ago who just came back with £8, and she said, I spent £2 on something I just couldn't for the life of me think of what else to buy. I'm sorry. And we had another lady who used her husband's aftershave that was apparently quite expensive. I'd never heard of this aftershave, probably because it was quite expensive aftershave. And she took it to a charity shop and said, look, can I donate this to you on the understanding that you do me a receipt saying it cost me £10 to buy it back off from you? And of course, with that margin, she managed to sell this on eBay for something like £50. And so there was a bit of a discussion in the office in terms of whether she'd broken the rules and this was bad behavior, or whether it was something completely different to that. And for me, I saw it as being extremely innovative, and she is still with us, and she is one of the most innovative in the company by far, except for me, of course. I wouldn't dare give her that title above me. Can I just finish with a little pithy statement that I came across, which I quite like. I thought might be quite relevant today. And it's this: pessimism is an indulgence. Orthodoxy is the enemy of invention. Despair an insult to the imagination. And that was by Wayne Davis. So that's me in 37 minutes. So I think that was roughly what I was billed to say.
Done, Barry.
Okay, I hope you found that useful. I don't know you in the group, so I've no idea really where to pitch this, but I hope you took something from that. So can I
Thank you, Barry.
give it all back to you? And I don't know, Owen, are you in charge of sort of facilitating and things, or is it?
Go, Ellen.
I can row in there and
Lovely, thank you. Over to you then.
And I like the way you kicked off with Matthew Syed's book. It's excellent. I think it's probably one of the first ones I've read of its type. But again, I would have a similar opinion around things like neurodiversity, as well as the more obvious things. Maybe religion is one that people are very uncomfortable with, and ethnicity in general. Gender is something that people get very worked up about, but in general, I think there's more ways to be diverse than are immediately apparent. And there are some types of diversity that just don't necessarily look that good when you're putting together the photo op with the United Colors of Benetton for the annual report. There are lots of things lurking under the thing. I think class is a huge one in lots of societies, and I think thinking styles, introverts and extroverts. There are lots of ways to slice and dice this. So I'm just wondering, where do you start, and maybe use your lawyer hat on this one, because if you start putting together something that's a balanced board, and it's got a great composition of male and female, or from your part of the world, different parts of sectarian divide, where do you start? Do you get into trouble because you don't have anyone with OCD on the board? Do you get into trouble if you don't have anybody with dyslexia? You could what's a sensible way to kind of start structuring that kind of thinking?
Yeah, it's a really good question, and I think if you were to start with Jordan Peterson, he would say, look, it's all a load of rubbish, and what we're trying to achieve here is just unachievable. And we're finding a few convenient categories, 9 categories, but there are a lot more than that. And if you went into the neurodiversity space, you'd find 50. And I think perhaps what you're pointing at is that from a neurodiverse point of view, you could have 9 people that look exactly the same, but they're very, very different in terms of the diversity that they bring from a cognitive point of view. But of course, visually, you can't represent that. And if you're doing a really quite superficial scan of composition of boards, then you're going to be caught out straight away there. Now, who knows, with the advent of and the development of AI, maybe we will be in a position in which we can record it, detect it, analyze it much better, and we'll have a very different understanding of DNI and what it means, and in particular, neurodiversity. It's a big struggle in both jurisdictions, and I'm sorry, Emerson, if I'm just talking about the North and the South and the 2 jurisdictions, and please feel free to jump in if you'd like to. I think, are you from another jurisdiction? I think I picked it up before you were.
You're mute, Emerson.
Can't hear you, Emerson.
Emerson's from Trinidad and Tobago.
I thought so.
And I'll give him a second to get his mic on and respond to himself. But if you're there, Emerson, if you can.
Yeah. The challenge that
yes, I am from the country of Trinidad.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Thank you. The challenge that we've got, even on our latest survey census, we only have about 5% ethnic minority in the North still. It's very, very low. And Republic of Ireland is greater. I think it's around 10%. But again, it's really quite low. So if we are trying to get a visual representation of each group on a board or even on an interview panel, it's, quite frankly, it's impossible. I've got somebody who works in recruitment here in a big company, employ about 500 people. And he said to me, I have interview panels of 3. how could I get an ethnic minority person on each of these panel of 3? And I said, well, I don't think you have to. I think if you have 3 panel members over a period of 12 months, I would expect that you would have representation of ethnic groups on those panels, which sits roughly with the population that we have. But the idea that you have to have an ethnic representative on every panel of 3, I think is just really misinterpreting what it is that is required to do. And certainly from a legal point of view, you don't have to do that. John, is your hand up there? And over to you, John.
Okay, I'm muted there. Actually, you possibly answered part of my question already, Barry. I had two things actually. One of the things you mentioned actually was regard to the diverse groups and that, and I was going to ask you actually, how do you balance the competency requirements with the diversity requirements? Like Nirvana would be, you've identified 6 competencies. You actually have identified people that cross 6 different diversities. That's Nirvana. But which comes first? Yeah.
Well, this is a point that Syed talks about in his book at some length in terms of the CIA. And the big discussion that they had was that, okay, if we want to go for diversity, we have to accept that there's going to be a drop in performance levels. And others were disputing that and saying, well, actually, no, that's not the right thinking at all. As long as you've got a good mix of skills amongst the group, then it should level out, and then you should be able to get the benefits that come from greater diversity. I suppose you could do a number of things, and you could start by looking at your core competencies and actually scrutinize them and say, well, look, are these core competencies that are still valid for either this team or this particular post? And are any of these likely to be excluding people from different backgrounds? And is that, one of the reasons why we haven't got greater diversity here to begin with? So there is stuff that you can do, I think, there. You can also, of course, change how you advertise and how you source people. You can, there are recruitment companies that do specialize in sourcing from particular underrepresented groups. So there is some work that you can do there to actually address an issue that you have what appears visually, at least, to be quite a homogenous group. Over to John or
the second part actually, just a quick question. This the point 3, safety to speak, I think is actually huge, but a very important part of that actually is the choice of words. I was actually at a conference yesterday actually where the facilitator came along and actually said sometimes people say something where the meaning can be interpreted incorrectly by someone else, or sorry, it's open to perception, right? What they're actually saying. So one of the points he actually made was to go on and say, if there's a trigger in you actually where someone is actually saying something that is actually, oh, that's sending up a red alert, try and actually stop and pause and work out what exactly was the person trying to say, as distinct from what your immediate perception of it was.
Okay, that's interesting.
That's a huge one actually within companies, because sometimes people are afraid to say something in case someone else perceives it in an inappropriate way.
Yeah, and in a way, I think we're back to Nancy Klein a little bit here and the thinking environment. And she's saying, look, if we're given space to think before we talk and contribute in a meeting, you'll get better contributions, better quality contributions. And the opposite of that is you're going to get people racing in with a contribution in a meeting because they just want to get in ahead of other people, thinking that if I don't use this moment, I'm not going to get another moment to come into a meeting for a good while.
And this is why we try and work visually in innovation practice. So you put that post-it up there whenever it suits you, and you turn around and you review it, so everyone's comments get included. So I'm just, in the interest of trying to move through it, I'm just seeing William and Catherine and Owen all stacked up with questions.
Lovely, thank you.
William's up first, according to Microsoft Teams.
Oh,
Fingers on the butters, folks, if you want to ask another question.
You're better at Microsoft Teams than I am. Okay.
Thanks. First of all, Barry, thanks very much for the presentation. It was excellent and very, very, very stimulating. So thank you very much for that. Well, my question is, how long did it take you to instill these values and ideals into your organization? And do you feel that they're fully embedded now?
Oh, that's a great question, William. I did it first badly, very badly, and I said, look, these are the things that I'll work. They're up on the wall. Read them and do them. And first of all, it created some resistance and pushback. And secondly, a lot of people just thought, oh, this is Phillips playing around again. We'll ignore that. So other than something good to say at an event like this, it hadn't worked first time round. And second time round with it, it was far more engaging. And I thought, I've got to go underneath them and sort of say, listen, folks, this is what the environment we're trying to create here. So can I have your ideas and your post-it notes in terms of how we can do fresh thinking, how we can look at things from a different sort of perspective, and how we can come up between us all with the sorts of ideas that are going to be beneficial to the company, because it doesn't make sense to leave it to one or two people. If everybody is coming with ideas and thinking in different ways, it's going to be very powerful. So we had a day at it with an outside facilitator. And I think basically we did in one day what I was trying to do in 5 years. And I did badly in 5 years. But by 5 years and that one day, I think we had got to a point in which staff did get it and did begin to practice it a bit. Another thing we did was to stand in meetings. And so our first all-staff meeting on Monday started with us standing in a circle. And it's amazing, we used to have an all-staff meeting that lasted an hour and 20 minutes. But when we're all standing, it all finished in 20 minutes. So, that kind of said something to me. Does that answer your question, William?
Yeah, it does. And it's interesting that you say 5 years, because when I had my own business, I tried to do something similar to what you did, but not to the same great extent. I was trying to build a team environment and a cohesive team environment. And I would say that, yes, I succeeded to a certain extent, but I always say to people, it took me at least 5 years to get people to that level. Okay. And part of the problem was people's, I suppose, mistrust of themselves as much as the mistrust of everybody around them.
Okay.
Do you know what I mean? That even though you give them the freedom to do certain things, they still reverted back to me as the boss.
Yeah.
Am I doing it right or whatever? And I had to disappear for a while in order to let them float to get it back. Yeah. But it's interesting that you said 5 years. So.
Okay. Just very quickly on that, William, what we introduced, and we need to go back to this, was a coaching style from managers to employees, so that when they came to you, rather than you giving them the answer, you would coach them and help them to find the answer and sort of empower them to take the decision themselves. And after we had that coaching with managers, for a while, it worked well, and we did notice that decisions were taken at a much more, a lower level, and that was healthy for a number of reasons. It brings me slightly back into this open door policy that many managers or leaders of businesses boast that they have, and I really don't like it. I really think open door policies are just not the right type of thinking. It's very much like a get out of jail card for a business leader to sort of say, well, the person's just resigned. Why didn't they come and see me and tell me that they were unhappy? My door's always open. And it's an excuse not to do communication well, to have it structured, to have a dashboard of communication, you know, as well as the fact you don't want people coming in every 5 minutes asking you how to do something. You want to be getting on with the work that you should be doing, you know. Okay. Are we?
I think we had Catherine, but I'm not sure, Catherine, you were
Oh,
dealing
no,
with,
we have Catherine.
Oh, good.
Yep.
Yeah,
And,
we were dealing,
Okay,
dealing with
Catherine.
wildlife, so go for it.
Catherine,
Okay.
Catherine is slightly agitated.
Oh, good. Okay.
For a variety of reasons. Sorry, not with you, Barry, right?
Oh,
Of course. Thank you very much.
I was looking forward to a little bit of a punch up there. Oh,
Yeah. Oh, don't
okay.
worry, it's coming.
Thought it might be.
So my challenge is, like, I am literally regularly the only woman on this call. And in fact, in terms of innovation, that is a pretty, you know, realistic statistic.
Yeah.
Because girls, since their childhood, get twice as much negative feedback as their brothers, right?
Okay.
And women particularly internalize it. Okay, that is a statistic that's widely known. So innovation, then when we get to the professional workplace, or even in, you know, education, wherever, you get to a professional workplace whereby women get feedback for performance, men get feedback for potential. Okay.
Yeah.
So if you're in an innovation space where the outcomes are unclear, and perhaps, as we all know intellectually, that they should end in failure because it's a test or it's a validation, that feedback is negative, right? And it's not, so therefore that sense of, well, why would I put myself forward for that?
Mm-hmm.
Because if I'm going to get negative feedback because of the poor response, I'm not going to put myself forward into that space. Now, interchange that with somebody in a minority, be it whatever, you know, in that group. Like, these are structural issues that are across the board, right? But I was working with a woman this morning, very competent, top of her game, and has been asked to be on a board, put herself forward, and they talked her up. And then came the drop of, sure, we need to make our quota or we won't get our public funding. Now, you may as well have taken out all of the air out of her balloon.
Yeah.
Because she's just there to make up numbers. She would buy and sell the chairman, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And this is what's happening time and time again. I remember we were in Maynooth University talking to those people who didn't want to, they were innovation students and they don't want to work in innovation because it's hard, right?
Mm-hmm.
Now, intellectually, it's not hard. Emotionally, it's very difficult.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point, actually. In fact, I'll even write that down. I really like that. Do you know, we struggle a lot here in the North with you know, symbolic representations on boards. Now, some boards, we are getting past that, thankfully. And, you know, a few years ago, I was, you know, and it was window dressing. Oh, we need a woman on this board because we've got 8 men and so on. But I'm afraid, and it's an awful thing that, you know, to admit to myself 2 years ago, even that was a step forward because it meant there was at least one woman on a board. Mm-hmm. And at least it was an opportunity for the others on the board to see how valuable that contribution was, to see that they were just as good as everybody else, and quite possibly better in many things, and also to advocate for more females.
But statistically, unless there's 2 or more, they won't be effective.
Is that right? Okay, I'm not aware of that statistic, but all I can say is there's still a huge amount of work to do. I'm afraid, a huge amount of work. But as regulations are beginning to develop, I think some organisations are going to get caught out when it comes to things like tenders if they haven't got a reasonably balanced board. At least from the gender point of view, they just won't get contracts. And at the end of the day, business, drives a lot of things. There's a company I won't name not far from here, and they're in a business largely run by women, and they've got 8 board members and not one female on the board. And I've talked to their head and I've said, look, you have to change that. And he's sort of looking at me and saying, well, it works and so on and so forth. I say, well, in a few years' time, there's going to be regulations that are going to penalise you for this. So, you choose how you want to do it.
Right, and just that's an interesting point, Barry. But just in the interest of time, sorry to cut across, but Owen had his hand up for ages, and we haven't heard from Mr. Flavin all of the call. So jump in, Owen, while we have a minute and a half left or something, 2 minutes left.
Yeah, and that never happens. So there's something wrong when you haven't heard from me. Really love that, Barry. I've got a quick question, but we don't really have to develop the answer very far. You've got things like excellence through people, investors in people, great place to work, healthy place to work, and other branded. Now you can criticize all those things. Have you seen some good in any of those? Would you highlight any of those kinds of approaches or models or brands that do have something in the right direction in terms of impact across workplaces?
Yeah, that's a great question, Owen. And I have to say, whether it's something to do with, I'm becoming a crusty, cynical male. I'm beginning to see fewer and fewer of these badges and awards evenings that I think are actually worthwhile. Now, one exception is investors in people. And you might say, oh, I would say that because we've got platinum of that. So, but I do think it is quite a rigorous process. It requires interviews with all staff, and it is available both north and south. It's a lot more popular in the north than the south, but it's available in both jurisdictions, and it is quite rigorous. There are a lot of badges that organisations like to wear and how much they really mean. I would question, I wouldn't like to, in this forum, just name names, but if anybody wanted to get in touch with me, I would certainly name some good ones in your particular space. However, and it's coming back to this point that we shared with Catherine, if it is window dressing and it is a badge saying we do D&I or what have you, it is at least something that an employee can hold an employer to and saying, okay, you're saying you're doing this, but look how you are treating me because I'm in a wheelchair and I've got access issues, and you're banging on about this publicly and trading off it. So it does present some sort of level of accountability that maybe is better than nothing.
And as so often happens with these things, we're 30 seconds over, and just the tip of the iceberg has just been breached, and there's so much more under the waterline to be discussed. So, Barry, thanks a million for that. That was absolutely fascinating.
Brilliant, Barry. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Like I've just Bruce Springsteen, leaving the audience for dying for more.
Thank you. I've just shared my email address with people. If you wanted to get in touch or just connect on LinkedIn or what have you, be lovely to do that. And I hopefully see you as a member of the audience listening to one of you speak next or on a future occasion. But thank you very much. Really enjoyed that. Really did.
Thanks, Barry.
All the best.
Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everyone. Enjoy all of your weekend.
Take care.
Bye, folks.
Bye. Bye. Bye.